All right, so the cloud beckons, but is it safe? Today, we're going to be covering talking about cloud security. So what we'll cover today is thinking about cloud security, what exactly security means. We're actually going to start talking about what the cloud means and what we are talking about when we talk about cloud computing. We're going to look at prioritizing security for your organization, a multi-level security model, or how to think about establishing good security for your organization, and then what to look for in vendors that you're going to be using for cloud services or really any kind of services as relates to security. First, we're going to talk a little bit about Idealware. So Idealware provides thoroughly researched, impartial, and accessible resources about software to help nonprofits make smart decisions. So if you look at the Idealware website, you'll see they publish a number of articles and reports and provide a number of webinars like the one that you're participating in right now that help nonprofits understand and think about technology and technology services.
There's always sound issues.
Oops, all right. So introduction as to who I am. My name is Joshua Pesquet. I'm an Idealware expert trainer, and I'm also the co-founder of Roundtable Technology. Roundtable provides technology services. We have operations in New York City and in Maine. We provide services to over 100 nonprofit organizations and also work with some small and medium-sized private businesses. And I'm going to ask William to make his own introduction. Go ahead, William.
As the slide says, I'm William Guyton. I'm currently the Information Technology Manager at Legal Services Alabama. We're the statewide LSE funded provider in the state of Alabama.
Thank you so much. So William's going to be helping lend a specific legal services perspective to today's presentation. And he'll be kind of chiming in both when he thinks it's appropriate and when I ask him specifically to do so, providing, as we say, color commentary for this presentation. So I'll be doing most of the talking, and William will be jumping in as needed or as he feels is appropriate. All right, so let's start by talking about what is the cloud, and when we talk about cloud computing, what we're talking about. So you traditionally in technology, you can have information that's sitting on your computer or physically in your office on like a traditional file server. So if you look at the picture, you have the three computers that are kind of sitting inside of your network, and then the file server to the far right that's still in your network. And many organizations still operate this way. They might run a mail server. Most organizations still have a file server that's running in their physical office. And so that information isn't in the cloud, so to speak. It's physically sitting on computers in your physical office. As people have started to adopt services like Google Apps, like Microsoft Office 365, like Dropbox, like Box.net, and a whole panoply of other services where the information is actually stored and the applications to use that information is provided from the cloud, meaning from some service or infrastructure that's sitting in the internet. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about cloud computing, where you're taking the information, your actual data, and possibly your applications, and having them be hosted outside of your physical office, not on your own equipment. And that's what we're talking about by cloud computing. So the legal services grantees are using cloud computing. We've got almost 50% that said some or all of their servers are hosted externally. Almost 20%, so almost 1/5 of the organizations are using Google Apps for email already. So their email is already cloud-based. And 13% said they were using Google Docs, meaning some of their documents and the applications that they're using to edit those documents are cloud-based. So this is a service that's already being adopted somewhat, aggressively by legal services organizations already. William, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, and I think the adoption rate is going to do nothing but grow over time. I know in Alabama specifically, we're looking at a bifurcated type of architecture where we keep some workloads on premises and we send other workloads out to the cloud, primarily revolving around the cost of storage. Why do I want to pay $10,000 or $15,000 for some additional storage capacity when I don't need to spend that OpEx or that CapEx expenditure? I can actually provision some servers with Amazon or with Google or with Microsoft and save that $10,000 to $15,000 storage spend.
Right. We see a lot of different organizations here in the Northwest who are also doing the same thing based on cost.
And that takes us right, and you guys are so good. So it takes us right into our next slide, which is what is this lure of the cloud? Why are people moving into the cloud? Well, the low cost of entry for nonprofit organizations, a lot of the services are actually free. Office 365 and Google Apps are both available for free to most 501c3 organizations. It essentially solves all of your remote access issues. So if your information is based in the cloud to begin with, then the barrier to accessing that information is an internet connection, a web browser, and credentials to access the information. So you don't have to set up VPNs or any other kind of complicated infrastructure to allow remote access to your data or your application. And then also there's no complex infrastructure to manage. You don't have to have servers and uninterruptible power supplies and cooling and all the things that go along with running a data center. You offload all of that to the cloud provider. And so the other thing that I would add to this, particularly for small organizations and nonprofits, is that cloud computing really brings the highest level of enterprise technology to be available to you. So, you could never hope to build an infrastructure that would rival anything that Microsoft or Google has, but by essentially using their infrastructure or using Amazon's infrastructure and other organizations like that, you're getting top of the top infrastructure at little or in some cases no cost. And so it's a very, very attractive thing for small and medium-sized businesses. So, but what about security? And as someone who's spent the last decade helping people think about and move toward cloud computing in every way imaginable, it is by far the #1 question I get, which is, what about security, what about security, what about security? And there certainly are a lot of things to think about. And I would say that the #1 thing that I'll say about cloud security, and if you take kind of one thing away from this webinar, it would be that there's really nothing about the cloud that changes the security equation from having information stored on your network. If you have poor security practices, then the information is not secure wherever you're storing it. And if you have good security practices, then your information will be secure wherever you're storing it. It does not really matter whether it's in the cloud or on your premise. What matters are your own practices. And so that's going to be the focus of the rest of this presentation, is how you kind of do those things. So cloud security in the news, there's lots of different things about how big companies get hacked or suffer intrusions, do things. When we do the advanced cloud security, we're going to actually go into the details of kind of how some of these intrusions happen and how security breaches happen in small organizations and what are the kind of likely things that will happen. But suffice it to say, they do happen. They happen to small organizations. They happen to big organizations, and everybody reads about it. And in that way that we read about certain news stories, and it makes us feel that those threats are kind of disproportionate to what they really are. Anytime there's a major breach to a large company, it's big news. Everybody reads about it and assumes that these things are horribly insecure. specifically as relates to legal services. So, and I don't know if there's been advanced news on this, but this is the latest news we had, which is that the ABA is prepared to vote rules that saying require lawyers to make reasonable, quote unquote, make reasonable efforts to prevent inadvertent or unauthorized disclosure of or unauthorized access to confidential client information. So this does not in any way rule out legal services using cloud computing to store their information, even their confidential information, but it does require them to think through the use of it. And I'm going to ask William again if he has anything that he wants to talk about specific to this.
There's some ABA requirements. I know there's some LSC guidance. There's also at the state level, there are individual state security breach notification laws. 46 of the 50 states have a security breach notification law in the books now. It generally revolves around PII, personally identifiable information, social security numbers, date of birth, street address, things of that nature. And I'll email the URL to the National Conference of State Legislatures that references the laws in each state in terms of notification.
Thank you so much, William. And so that law basically would require you to disclose to anyone whose personal information was breached, that it was breached, the data was breached, and sort of what actions you've taken about it?
Right.
Okay. Thank you so much. So this make reasonable efforts thing is to me anyway, kind of intentionally a bit broad. But I think this is something that you should be doing regardless of whether it's legally required or not, is making reasonable efforts to, assure that your information is secure. So going back to when we talked about the difference between security in the cloud versus security in a traditional infrastructure, this slide kind of touches on this point, which is that even if information is sitting on a server in your office or sitting on a computer in your office, if you're connected to the internet, you are essentially in the cloud. Your computer becomes a part of the cloud at that point. So the fact that the data, that client file or that database that's sitting on your computer or on your server, the fact that it's physically there doesn't really mean much from a security perspective if that server or your computer that can access that server is connected to the internet. If you're on the internet, you're in the cloud. So all these security principles really are going to apply regardless of where you're storing your information. And I'll kind of continue to make that point as we go through the presentation. But we do a lot of things on the internet. We shop online, we bank online, we post things on Facebook. So why is the cloud different from that? And the answer is it's not. We have all the same security questions about our shopping when we're shopping on Amazon, when we're shopping at eBay, when we're banking, when we're on Facebook, and certainly everybody's seen lots of articles and notices about there being things on Facebook and security concerns that people have about Facebook. So, the reality is that, this security issue really, I hope anyway, that everybody that's sitting in this will take some of this information away and apply it to their personal information as well as to your business and your organizational information. Just yesterday, and this is a very common thing I get, is, people's personal Gmail, Hotmail, AOL accounts being compromised, and this poses a huge inconvenience, or potentially more than that, to people who this happens to, because all of their information that they have in that email account is exposed. All of the people that they have in their address book are subjected to various kinds of scams and emails that purport to come to that person. So there's a huge cost to kind of having lack of security and to having your information compromised, even if it's your personal information. So all the things we're talking about really apply in both cases. So how secure is your on-site data? So a lot of people are concerned about moving information to the cloud, but perhaps aren't so concerned about their current security situation, which is where everybody is. So if computers are not patched, if there's no one that's responsible for understanding and looking at the network security in your office, if people are not using strong passwords, or in some cases any passwords at all, which I see quite often still today, if the permissions for the network are not set properly, and this is again something I see all the time where there's confidential information that only 2 staff people should be able to access, but whoever set up the folder didn't check permissions on it, and it turns out that anyone who logs into the system can access that folder. There's no disaster recovery plans, so there's no backups or there's no offsite backups. So we don't necessarily think about the protection of your data as part of a security plan or as part of a security thought, but it very much is. As we'll get to when we talk about the pillars of security, availability or making sure that the data isn't going to be lost irretrievably is part of security. And then staff haven't had any security training. If we go back to the slide about RSA and Sony, the security breaches there, all of those happened predominantly because of staff who either opened an email they should not have or gave out information over the phone that they should not have. And so if you haven't trained your staff in sort of how should you behave in terms of protecting your information and protecting the organization's information, then your data is not secure now, whether it's in the cloud or whether it's on your office. Another thing that we'll sometimes hear is, well, A, we don't have any information that anyone would want, and then B, we're just a tiny little nonprofit, so no one's going to attack us or take our information. But the reality is, you're not so much trying to protect yourself from cyber attacks. You're not, if there's a determined hacker out there who really is bound and determined to get at some information in your organization, I'm here to tell you that generally speaking, you're out of luck. They're probably going to succeed. What you're really trying to protect against is inadvertent breaches and just general loss of data because of things like malware that destroy data on machines, or just automated kind of data retrieval programs that can breach a network and grab social security numbers, grab credit cards, grab confidential information. And then you're also trying to protect against staff just either inadvertently or because of lack of training, violating security procedures by distributing confidential information or posting it in a place that is public because they simply didn't know and there was no procedure to keep that from happening. So whether you're a one-person office or whether you're Google, you kind of need to take the protection of your data seriously. Many data security breaches, like I was saying, are just crimes of opportunity. So it's just the picture here is sort of you could go to the analogy of the kind of the weakest home on the block. So not locking your doors, not locking your windows. If someone's just going down the block looking for a home that's open and that's easy to get into, and you have the weakest security.
Hello, it looks like we might have been put on hold. Let me mute the line and then have our presenters unmute here. Just a second.
The conference is now in question and answer mode. All participants are now muted.
So *6 should unmute your line if you want to, or as the presenters.
This is Joshua. Can you hear me, Brian?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, great. And you were hearing me fine up until then?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Should I continue on now?
Go for it.
Okay. Moving right along. So going back to the analogy of not wanting to be the sort of easiest to break into home on the block, your home doesn't need to be Fort Knox. It just needs to be secure enough so that opportunistic criminals will move on and try another door. So your security of your network is very, very comparable to that, or of your cloud applications and of your cloud data. If your passwords are strong and the policies and procedures in your office are secure so that it's not easy to get information out of your office and to breach your security, then the crimes of opportunity will move on to an easier opportunity. And so you want to kind of set your bar as high or a little bit higher than the kind of standard for organizations like yours. And that will go a long way toward protecting your data. William, I've been chatting for a little bit. Is there anything that you want to throw in here, or should I keep trucking along? Are you still muted, William? All right, I will keep trucking along. So our data is not, I'm sorry. Okay, so the myth, our data is safe or not in the cloud, I've kind of covered that. Your data is equally safe or equally unsafe wherever it is, depending on the security of it. So if you look at a typical cloud data center, everything's in locked cabinets. Getting access to this room is typically going to require getting past a number of security measures. You're probably going to need a pass card. You're probably going to need a username and an ID, and you might even need biometric information. There might be armed guards outside the data center, literally armed guards outside the data center protecting it. So if you look at the physical security of where your information is physically being stored compared to what it might look like now, which hopefully this isn't community organizations here, but we've certainly seen this, just an unlocked server sitting in a room that doesn't really have any kind of security, might not even have a camera, might not have even a receptionist desk. So someone could easily walk in and just pick up your information and walk out the door with it. So not to mention that if it's not being patched, if the passwords aren't strong, someone would be able to get to it via the internet and be able to get to it. So, again, we're just kind of trying to address these notions of why security, is not safe in the cloud. So we're going to take a little pause here, and I'm actually, Brian, I'm not sure how easy this will be to do, but this was going to be one of the spots where I was going to pause and see if we had questions from anybody at this phase. Do you want to see if anyone wants to unmute and ask some questions?
Definitely. *6, if you're on the phone line, will unmute you. If you are on voice over IP, unfortunately, you can't unmute, but if you do type the question in the chat area, I'd be happy to read it out.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on the chat as well, so I can see.
William happens to be on voice over IP. He's getting to a phone and dialing in so that he can unmute himself. So it'll be a minute.
All right, I'm going to give it about 1 more minute, and if we don't get any questions coming in via the chat or anyone unmuting, I'm going to be there. So I see a question here from James. He says, I would be curious what people thought about the Chrome email I saw going through the list server earlier. Brian, I'm going to...
So this, just to update you, Josh, the email was regarding being able to view passwords, a list of passwords via Chrome, basically. And there's similar security issues with regards to viewing an email or viewing the user's passwords on Firefox. Yeah, and that's the basic.
Yeah, I mean, that is, I can address that very quickly. This probably will get addressed a little bit more in depth in the advanced session. But, most browsers, really every browser, will store passwords for you. And from a security perspective, that is definitely not recommended. There are really good password manager programs. 2 of the ones that I would immediately recommend, and I don't own stock in either of these companies, are Dashlane and LastPass. And I'll type these in. to the chat window. And what those programs will do, in addition to helping you maintain much stronger passwords for yourself, for all the systems you access, they will also clear your browsers of all their saved passwords. And so at that point, all the passwords that you keep are kept in a very secure encrypted system and are made available to you when you go to those websites. It's very convenient to use. It takes a little bit of learning to kind of get up and get used to using these programs, but once you do, you will be extraordinarily grateful that you have used them.
Excellent. I'll definitely check that out.
Any other questions before I move ahead? All right, I'll just talk for 10 more seconds about Dashlane and LastPass while we wait for other questions. So in addition to clearing out all the passwords from your browsers, they can actually perform a password audit for you. So what that means is that they see that you've used the same password at 4 different websites that you access. They'll offer to change them for you, and they'll generate very secure passwords. You don't need to worry about remembering or knowing any of these passwords because they're all in that password manager program, so they can be very complex. You have no need to know what they are. The only thing you need to make sure that you never lose is obviously your password to your password manager program. If you lose that, you will lose all of the other passwords that you have. The only way to get access back is to clear them out. So you definitely want to make sure you keep a secure copy of that password around somewhere. All right, we're going to move on. Thank you, everybody. All right, so what does security mean? Sorry about that. All right, there are 3 pillars of information security. I'm going to talk about each of these just for a little bit. So confidentiality. What we mean when we talk about confidentiality, and we talked about this a little bit before, is the restriction of who has access to the information and making sure that that's restricted to only people who should have access. So the example I used before was where there might be an HR folder that was supposed to only be available to the executive director and the HR director, but because it was permissioned improperly, every staff person in the organization had access to it and could view the payroll, could view the HR records, could view termination notices for everyone in the organization. So that would be an example of a violation of confidentiality, where the information that was supposed to be restricted to certain parties was in fact exposed to many more parties than that due to a lack of appropriate permission. And that confidentiality breach can obviously happen in any of a number of different ways. You can accidentally email a confidential document to the wrong person. You can post a confidential information in a place that you thought was private but turns out to be public. And so this, I would say, is one of the areas where you do have to be cautious in the cloud, particularly if you're using something like Google Apps, because users may not understand how things are shared. And so they may put something in a place that they thought was private just to them, but in fact is available to all the staff in the organization. And so as you adopt these cloud services, you want to make sure that you're providing appropriate training so that staff understand how to maintain confidentiality in those systems. And obviously with legal services, even that much more important. So integrity touches on how confident you are that the data has not been damaged or changed in any way. And so this kind of also ties in with confidentiality. If the restrictions are appropriate so that people can't change the data or modify it, unless they have permissions to do so, then that gives you a reasonable course of integrity. And then the other thing is that having audit trails so that you understand who has edited a document, when they edited a document, so that if you discover that the integrity of a document or data has been compromised, you know when it happened and can revert back to earlier versions. And this, contrasting the confidentiality piece, is actually an area where, if any of you are familiar with Google Docs, that is much easier to do with cloud-based systems than it is to do with a typical file server. William, I don't know if you want to address that also, but with Google Docs, it's very easy to go see all the revisions over the history of a document. So if you discover an integrity problem, it's really, really easy to go back and look at an earlier version. William, are you back online yet? No. Okay. So availability, I talked.
I definitely concur there. We use Google Docs for most of the documents that LSNTAP does, and it's super easy to go back through, look at that version history. Also, the permissions are pretty easy to grant, as you've got levels ranging from just giving an individual user access securely to all the way up to publishing documents that you're working on publicly, to kind of intermediate where anybody who has a link can get access to that and either view or edit as you choose.
Yep. And so the last pillar of information security is availability. And I talked about this a little bit before as well, where people don't often think things like backups and disaster recovery plans fall under the umbrella of security, but in fact they do, because availability means, is the information going to be available when it's needed, and in some kind of permanent way if it's required to be kept. So do you have some reasonable assurance that if data is deleted or stolen or something happens to make that data no longer available, that you can restore from an earlier version of it? So availability, integrity, confidentiality, the three pillars of security. So confidentiality, information available only to authorized parties. Integrity, information isn't modified inappropriately, and that you can track who or what made the change and when that change was made. And availability, assurance that data is accessible when needed by authorized parties.
I just want to also remind people to take a quick look at the chat there, as there is some additional password suggestions that are in there, and also Kate Blado added a source site to a recent case that covers some of our requirements or data breach issues on there. So there's links to that in the chat.
Fantastic. And Kate, yeah, I'm also a big fan of KeyPass. That's another one that I like a lot. The reason I didn't throw that out is that I find it requires it's a little bit less user-friendly than Dashlane and LastPass, but it is absolutely a great password manager. All right, so physical possession. Whoever has the data could, for instance, turn it over to the government. And so this is something to consider, although some people, I think, use this argument at times. And Brian, I think, I believe this is a topic I think you have some interest in terms of information security, so you may have something you'd like to contribute here. But if Google, for instance, has your information and they are subpoenaed by the government to hand over that information, they are pretty much going to hand over that information. So you're not going to have an opportunity to kind of intervene in that process in any way. Now, if that data is sitting on a server in your office and the government wants that data, then the government is also going to get that data because they're just going to walk into your office with police officers and take it. So in either case, my general suggestion to organizations who have this concern because of the nature of work they're doing, and there's a number of instances where people may be concerned that a government entity is, whether it's the U.S. government or a foreign government, may have interest in getting their information or may legally seek to get their information, is you need to use encryption. And if you encrypt the data that you are concerned about, at that point, it doesn't really matter whether that data is stored, again, in your office or in the cloud. The encryption is the protection of that data. The encryption program that we typically will have people use, I'll type this into the program is called TrueCrypt, and there are lots of other ones out there. But if you encrypt the information yourself, then there's a chance that you may be able to keep that information from anyone who would want it, particularly if you encrypt it in an extremely secure way. And I'm not going to talk too much further about that, but Brian, do you have anything you want to throw in there, or William?
No, I definitely agree there. I've worked some with organizations outside of my role at NTAP who are involved with direct government or litigation against the government for privacy. reasons, such as ACLU and EFF, and they avoid cloud-based providers entirely because they want to know specifically if the government is requesting information. In the way that security letters are set up, that cloud-based provider doesn't have to or may even be under a gag rule in order to tell you that your information has been turned over to the government. I haven't seen any legal services organizations with similar concerns, as we're directly representing clients and not suing the government, but there definitely are some nonprofits that are very, very in tune to those issues.
That is awesome information, Brian. That is not something I knew, and I'm so glad to have you on this call because that's a great piece of information to have. So if I'm understanding you correctly, like they keep the information not for a security reason, but really so that they will know if someone is requesting that information. Because if they're keeping it with Google or with Microsoft, then that request goes to Microsoft, and Microsoft may, as part of that request, be required by the government not to say anything to the person whose information is being requested.
Exactly.
Okay. That is really great information. Thank you, Brian. All right. So what does security mean for you? Well, what if you just wanted to be totally secure, not worry about anyone accessing your information? Well, you could just shut off your internet connection and not allow anyone to access your data or your systems. Most of you, I hope, having been through the first 45 minutes of this presentation, could already understand that still really wouldn't protect your information. It would still be on a computer somewhere unless you had very good security protecting the physical access to that computer or to that information where you're storing it. The bunker on the side of the hill is protected here. The information still may not be as secure as you'd like it to be. But be realistic. We have to operate in an internet society. So to start, you want to think about what kind of information are you protecting? And we were just talking about this a little bit in terms of encryption. And this is one of the kind of first conversations that I'll have with organizations when we start talking about security for their organization, which is, what is the value of your information? What is the nature of the kind of work you're doing? Because all of these kinds of things are going to affect, how much people may be trying to access your information or destroy your information or in some way violate the integrity or the confidentiality of your information. And so you need to think about all those things as it relates to your organization. With legal services, primarily, the difference for you, for your types of organizations from others, is that confidentiality issue, that confidentiality of much of your information. If that's violated, that has more significant consequences for you and for your clients than it would for, let's say, a theater group, where the only information that someone may have got is how many tickets they sold last year, how many people came to their performances. So red flags. If you're keeping donors' credit card numbers, if you're keeping scanned images of checks, if you're keeping bank account information, if you're keeping social security numbers, and generally speaking, we would hope that you're not keeping any of these things in your own security set. That if you're accepting donations, if you're taking credit cards, that you're using a third-party provider that's completely PCI compliant, to do that. That these kinds of things are being handled by outsourced providers that have appropriate security in place. But if you're doing any of these things on your systems, then that's a definite red flag and something you very much need to look out for. Is storing data in the cloud, does it constitute disclosure that destroys the privileged nature of data? So this is a specific legal services question. And I'm going to ask William, if he's back online, to comment on this. But essentially, the ruling that we've seen and what the ABA has determined is that the answer is no. Putting it in the cloud does not constitute disclosure that destroys the privileged nature of the data. But you do, again, going back to that term, you have to make reasonable effort to secure your data. William, I'm gonna stop for a minute. Are you there? Nope, we don't have William back yet. Okay. So I'm going to move on here, except to say that from a legal services perspective, there is nothing inherently about putting your data in the cloud that destroys the privileged nature. But again, and this is what the whole webinar is focused on, you do have to think about how you're going to handle that data in the cloud.
One other thing people should probably be aware of is that a lot of the state bar ethics committees or ethics groups are currently looking at this issue. We've seen a few opinions that have been issued in states like New York that have been very positive towards cloud services, but your state bar may currently be reviewing or soon to be reviewing this type of an issue.
All right, thanks, Brian. So basically, everybody should be checking their local state bar to see, whether they have currently issued any regulations or guidelines, and should be in some manner keeping abreast of those things. Is that essentially right,
yep,
Brian?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what's your exposure? Consider the impact of exposure of your confidential information, both in monetary terms and in terms of your reputation. And from a legal services perspective, legally, what is your exposure if the information is breached? What's the impact of an outage? How much staff time could you lose from a short-term or prolonged outage? So I'm based out of New York. Most of you have probably heard of Hurricane Sandy, which hit last year. Hurricane Sandy led me to probably do more cloud implementations in the span of 3 months than I had done in the previous year, because so many organizations were knocked offline because they basically lost power for at least a week, and many organizations were without power and or internet service for several weeks. So if your organization was not in the cloud, so to speak, then you had a very difficult situation to make your information available to people who were at home because the office was inaccessible and without power, but had internet and could work and could potentially do things, but had no means to get to their email or files or applications or databases because all the information was sitting on a server or on servers that were in an office that had no power and no internet. And so again, while this seems to fall a little bit outside of the realm of security, we talked before about availability of data. And so this is a huge area where the cloud just provides, a tremendous advantage over traditional infrastructure in terms of you're very much protected from those kinds of outages. If all of your information that is critical to day-to-day business working is available via the cloud, then all people need is a device and an internet connection and the appropriate credentials, and they can work and they can access the critical information. And you can shut down the power to your office for as long as you want, and people can still access that information. So that really is a big advantage of the cloud, and one of the main reasons why a lot of people move to the cloud is immediately after they suffer some kind of extended outage. Either a critical server just fails, the hardware fails, or the internet to their office goes out for an extended period, or they lose power to their office, or there's some kind of a natural disaster so they can't physically go to their office. All of those things make people think much more seriously about cloud computing. Testing your on-site security. So do you have time to periodically check whether security patches are up to date, conduct what's called a pen test or a systems penetration test, which means hiring somebody usually to attempt to breach your network and violate the confidentiality of your information to see where there are weaknesses, to train employees on security procedures, to test your backup and recovery. If not, if you don't have time to do these things, or you're not doing these things and doing them rigorously, then you'd likely increase your security by moving to the cloud. So not only would the cloud not, represent a security risk for you, you'd actually be significantly improving your security by moving the information that's on systems where these things aren't being done to moving them to a cloud system where these things are being handled by a Google or a Microsoft or an Amazon. All right, we're going to take a break here. We're going to open it up again for questions. Again, if you are on via voice over IP through join.me, you cannot unmute, but you can put in questions through the chat. Otherwise, it's *6 to unmute.
Yeah, Jeff Hogue also made 2 great points in the chat there. One of them is that TrueCrypt is compatible to use basically inside of Dropbox or Google Drive. And also he put a link in there to a shared Google Doc, very right on point there, to a memo that addresses the privilege issues in New York.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Those are great links. And yes, you absolutely can put a TrueCrypt volume inside pretty much all of the cloud services file sharing. Great stuff, Jeff. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions at this point? William, if you can talk, do you have anything you want to add at this stage? If not, I will continue trucking along.
So a few months ago, Liz ran a great roundtable and also published an article for us on disaster recovery and disaster preparedness that's up on the LSNTAP website. And I definitely recommend checking it out because they're very related issues to what we're talking about today.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would say that we're using the term disaster recovery, but I would say that the standards for most organizations at this point should really be what we would describe as business continuity. So just very quickly, I would consider disaster recovery sort of the assurance that your data is protected in the event that it's destroyed from its primary source. So the example of if the data is on a server in your office and that server, someone knocks a water cooler over onto it and it becomes completely unusable, that there's a backup of that data somewhere that is current that you would be able to retrieve the data from. So that's disaster recovery. Business continuity takes that same scenario where someone dumps a water cooler on the server and says, not only is the data safe, but we can actually get to it and access it and continue working with minimal disruption, meaning less than a few minutes or a few hours. To be able to immediately begin using that information again. And so that's a big difference for a lot of organizations, and I think something a lot of organizations don't fully understand. And so they say, well, we have backups, so we're fine, and then they're surprised when their server dies and they can't use any files for 3 days while someone rebuilds the server and restores the data to it. So very important to understand the difference between those two concepts. And we're going to cruise along now. All right, so multi-level security is the ideal. All right, so we'll start from the outside. So your network in this image is at the very top of the castle with the guard sitting up there with the spear. And you kind of work your way into the network. So we have physical security, network security, transmission security, access controls, and protected data storage. So we're just going to walk through these one by one. So physical security, guarded facilities, protection of your hardware and devices, power redundancy, co-location, all of these things. So if any of you have ever undergone an audit or anything like that, one of the first things an auditor will ding you on is if there's not restricted physical access to your servers or to your critical information. So if your server is just sitting under a desk somewhere or in an unlocked server room or is in a shared space with other staff that are not network administrators, then your physical security at that point is obviously compromised in some way. And you have to be the judge, again, going back to this term of making reasonable efforts, of what risk that really poses to you based on what you know about your office and the availability of people to get into your office. So I visited literally hundreds of different offices, and there's some where you could easily just go up the elevator and walk in and pick up equipment and walk out, and there's no security cameras, and there's nothing that would prevent that. And then there's other offices, where you're going to get stopped at the front desk of the building and have to show an ID and get signed in. They're not going to let you up without calling someone upstairs who verifies that you have to come in, all that. So think through what the kind of security to your actual premises and to the physical stuff that's keeping your information. And again, when you look at the cloud, to some degree this is mitigated because that information, you don't have to worry about the physical security to Google. They'll worry about that. But you do still have to think about, could someone just walk in and sit down at a computer that's logged in and has access to confidential services? Or, what if Brian gets his laptop stolen from a laptop? What data is on, that device or on the mobile phones that people use? So with today's world, with so many mobile workers, that kind of physical security idea gets stretched quite a bit, and so that has to be taken into account. So network security. Do you have intrusion prevention, intrusion detection, firewall systems, and network proactive antivirus protection? This is also called UTM, or Universal Threat Management. So there are pretty standard firewalls that are not prohibitively expensive that will do all of this for you. If you're talking about small offices of under 25 computers or under 25 people that are using, these devices will set you back somewhere between $400 and $600 to get up and install, and may cost another $100 or $200 every couple of years to renew their services. So it's not a huge expense. They provide a great level of security of what we call the gateway or perimeter of your network. So looking at the moat example, it's basically everything that comes in from the outside, meaning the internet, and wants to get to your network has to go through that system. And that system, if it's getting multiple updates a day from a company like SonicWall or Fortinet or Cisco, then that's a huge security addition for you. So access controls, we've talked about this. Ensuring that the right people have access to the right data. So one of the things that I'll do, especially with legal services organizations that I work with, is implement periodic reviews of the security. And then we'll also ensure that people are using security groups as opposed to individual security, and we'll talk about that more in the advanced session. But the more that you can use groups and group memberships to provide security controls, the easier it is to manage your security effectively on a long-term basis. And so I would suggest that having reviews of security, the confidential information, quarterly or semi-annually is probably appropriate. Restricting physical access to the server, to computers that people are logged into with access to confidential information, and then training your staff on appropriate passwords, security measures, and where appropriate, enforcing appropriate passwords and security measures. Data protection. So you can encrypt your data if you're very concerned about its confidentiality. Making sure that you have backup and restore policies and procedures, and that those are tested. So if you have a backup, you need to make sure that the backup is monitored, that someone gets some notification indicating that the backup has either been successful or has not been successful. You have to have the ability to purge deleted data. So as legal services firms, you may actually need to rid yourself of data so that it is not recoverable by anybody, and make sure that that deleted data isn't available in some other place. So this is kind of the digital version of paper shredding, making sure that data that you delete doesn't wind up outside the security controls that you put in place and is not recoverable. Also making sure that the data you back up doesn't wind up outside of the security controls that you've set up in the permission. The ability to prevent government entities from getting your data with a subpoena, we talked about at some length. And so I'm going to move on from that. All right, so now we're going to talk about vendors. So how to evaluate cloud vendors as you're looking to use people, use outside sources, use cloud computing to manage your email, manage your data, to have applications if you're using things like Salesforce or donor databases that are stored online. How can you evaluate the vendors and be sure that they are practicing appropriate security policies so that you can feel comfortable? All right, so description of the security mechanisms that they have in place. So they should be able to provide you documentation, and generally pretty thorough documentation, about the facets of their security. If you talk to their sales staff or their support teams, they should be able to talk about their security and talk about it intelligently. All right, you want your vendor to demonstrate to you that security is something that they take very seriously, that they think is important, and that they want to be transparent to the extent responsible. Obviously, they don't want to tell you everything about how they handle their security. So you want to make sure that it's something they take very seriously and are willing to give you detailed information about how they do that. Uptime. So we'll talk about uptime figures. So they're described in nines. So you can have 99% uptime, which sounds pretty good until you realize that that means you're down for 3.5 days a year. So then you can go up to 99.9% uptime, which gets you down to about 12 hours, I believe, downtime a year, 99.99, which gets you down to 4 hours a year. And then the highest industry standard is 5 nines, which is less than an hour of downtime a year. I've got a question that came in on the chat. Okay, we'll get to that on the next thing. All right. So almost any cloud provider should be able to give you what their historic uptime has been. Just as an example, Google Apps for Gmail, for Google Docs, for those services, they provide currently 99.9% uptime. Microsoft's Office 365 service, Dropbox, Box.net, all those services are currently providing 99.9% uptime, which means you can expect roughly 4 to 8 hours of downtime a year, and that downtime could take the form of being unable to log into the service, there being a performance issue with the service, or just the service being completely unavailable for some period of time. Anybody who's used these services for any length of time has probably experienced 1 or 2 outages. They also all have what are called health status pages that you can usually check. So if your service is down, you can usually go to a health status page, and you can usually find it just by doing a Google search for that plus health status or online status, and that'll tell you what their online status is and if they think there's a timeline to a resolution when that will be. Also keep in mind that your connection to the internet is probably going to be the weakest link to your cloud services, and particularly as relates to uptime. So one of the things that we talk about with organizations, and I know you're scattered around the country, but you may want to look at, as you move more and more of your services to the cloud, especially if that's reducing some of your infrastructure costs, at investing some of that saved money in a backup internet connection. What we do with most of the organizations that we work with is suggest that they have a minimum of 2 internet connections. Typically, they'll have one that's maybe a bit of a higher cost, that's providing them a more reliable circuit that might be like a T1 circuit or an Ethernet over copper, or if it's available, a fiber circuit. And then we'll recommend they get a second circuit that'll just be the lowest cost, basic internet circuit they can get that's going to be the backup. And so we'll do what's called providing load balancing, so you can have both circuits working together so that you can take advantage of the bandwidth of both when they're working well. And then if your primary circuit goes down, you still have an internet connection via your backup circuit, since that becomes such a critical function for your organization. terms of service. This is the part that you guys as lawyers are much more equipped to handle than most people. So understanding what's in the terms of service, terms of privacy, and use of your data. And this is definitely a place where I'm very much interested to hear from Brian and William if they have kind of comments they want to add here. Google has come under some fire for their terms of service, which can to some be interpreted as saying that they essentially can do with your data whatever they like, and that technically they own it once you put it in their systems. Most people don't worry about that too much because they figure, you know, that safety in numbers, and that if Google starts giving away information and taking advantage of it, the damage to their reputation would be so severe that that's not a concern. But the terms of service, nonetheless, are a bit concerning to many who read it. But certainly, if you're working with a smaller provider and one that isn't, you know, at the level of an Amazon or a Google or a Microsoft, you'll want to read the terms of service very carefully, and especially whether they're required to tell you if they change their terms of service. As many of you know, Facebook came under pretty heavy fire for changing their terms of service without notifying everybody that was on Facebook, and now they do that, and they generally come under fire every time they do change the terms of service because people take it very seriously. I'm going to pause for a moment and see if Brian or William have anything they want to talk about here.
So the terms of service is definitely an interesting topic. So Google, with regards to things that are in your email or things that you put on Google Docs, they do take a license to be able to use that internally. Their current privacy policy says that that basically they're going to have automated services that go through that to improve their services, but that they do not externally sell or share that data. There are some individual vendors out there with much worse terms of service, and it's very difficult to follow when the terms of service or privacy policies change. Electronic Frontier Foundation has a wonderful site called Terms of Abuse that points out some of the larger violators there, but it's an area that is definitely not written to be understandable even by lawyers that deal with it. They're long policies with some major problems in them. Although when the terms of service for something like Google Docs is actually not that bad. Your data is kept for you, which is different than something like Facebook, where your data basically does become property of them, and when you delete something on Facebook, it's still going to be there forever. They just remove the link to it.
Very important distinction to understand is when you post information to a cloud service, whether deleting it from that cloud service will actually delete it, or whether it's going to remain there and potentially show up again if that provider like Facebook decides it wants to put it somewhere. Thank you, Brian. Very helpful.
And even with Google, it's unclear if that actually they're under no obligation to go back into their archives and remove things. I had an issue about 2 years ago with regards to a nonprofit and their analytics account. One of their employees accidentally deleted their analytics account, which said that it would be permanently destroyed. They unfortunately needed that information in order to do grant reporting. After a few weeks, Google was able to find a backup copy of that information in an archive. So even though it wasn't actually still there on their regular servers, it was sitting in an archive somewhere.
Yep. All right. Brian, thank you so much. Regulatory compliance. And so essentially, you know, does the vendor support organizations that need to be compliant with HIPAA? And then there could be other regulatory compliance. Again, with the ABA puts out an actual, you know, compliance regulations, then you need to be compliant with that. The general rule is that most cloud services can be made to be compliant with most regulations that are out there, HIPAA especially. And in reality, it's just like with security in general, just being in the cloud doesn't really change the security by itself. It's really, again, the practices that you are using in terms of how that information is managed, and going back to the 3 pillars of confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility. If you kind of go back to those things, most regulations will be focused on those 3 areas, which is, can those 3 things be guaranteed and audited in some way? And if they can, then you can have a reasonable confidence that you're going to be compliant with something like HIPAA and with other regulations. You also, and if you go through any kind of an audit, they will ask for these things. Make sure that they have current regulatory compliance letters, so the standards for SAF 70 and for SSAE 16 basically, will let you know they should be able to provide these documents to you upon request. You should get them annually from these organizations to make sure they are continuing to be certified in these areas, and that will give you insurance and your auditor's insurance that people that are hosting your data, hosting your applications are in compliance with appropriate security hardware and processes. Going back to credit card numbers again, so we talked about this before. The general idea would be that you don't want to be storing credit card numbers, and if you are, then you need to think really carefully about the systems that you're using to store those credit card numbers. But essentially, if that's being outsourced, then you just want to make sure that your vendor is going to be PCI compliant, which is the Payment Card Industry Payment Data Security Standards, or we just call it PCI compliance. And any payment processor is almost certainly going to be PCI compliant, but you still will absolutely want to check and verify that. And again, if you are for any reason needing to do that, like let's say you are running a theater company and you're handling tickets, so people are buying tickets from you, you'll generally want to isolate whatever system you're using to capture credit card data from the rest of your network, so that your PCI compliance is restricted to just those systems. Because trying to make the entirety of your network PCI compliant is going to be pretty burdensome. So that's something you'd want to avoid if you can. I'm going to stop here for a bit and see if we have any questions again from everybody. And then we're going to wrap up. So from Kate, we have a question. Anyone working with staff about when and when not to connect a cloud computing account to another service? For example, using a Google account to log into something like a social media site or mailstorm.com. It's a really good question, and something that is specific to cloud computing, which is as you start to link services to one another, what impact does that have on your security as you link services from one thing to the other? I do not have an answer for that, although I think it's a great question. Brian or William, have you run into that issue? Do you have thoughts about it?
Definitely run into the issue, and I have not seen a good policy or description of a good way to train staff with regards to that. For example, 3 days ago, I set up a YouTube account and was linking it to my Facebook. The permissions that Google asks for in doing that includes permissions to post to any page or wall that I'm an admin to, which includes legal services related pages and other nonprofits that I've worked with. That seems like a ridiculous thing to grant to YouTube if I just want them posting my personal videos to my wall, and there's no way to granularly control that interaction between those two applications. That's a very, very common practice in the industry also.
Yeah.
Yeah. I echo Brian's comment. It's extremely there is a mechanism to control it, and it's kind of an all or nothing type of linking, and I don't know of a good solution.
Yeah, and this kind of gets into a lot of these issues. Touch on, and in the advanced session we're going to go into this in some more depth. But there's kind of an inherent tension between security and convenience. And so if you want to kind of maximize your convenience, then you try not to think about security too much, and you just sort of grant access, and things work the way you want, but the security may not have. And then as you want to restrict security, so for instance, looking at Karen's question of employees linking on-premise services, like let's say your Outlook calendar, with a Google Calendar that is now outside of the corporate controls. So you can either restrict that completely and not let people do it and force them to go through IT, but that's obviously an inconvenience to people sort of working in the way that they just want to work, and also adds an additional burden to your IT department. Or you can, err toward convenience and allow people to do that, but then understand that there's security risks you're taking. So on a fundamental level, that's sort of the trade-off you're looking at. And as you think about these things, the best advice I can offer is that as an organization, you need to kind of look case by case and just kind of take a moment to think through the implications of allowing people to do those things and decide whether you want to either via policy or via technology restrict those things, or whether you want to allow them and kind of provide staff with some training and information so that they understand the risks that they're taking by doing that.
Right.
Really
there was a wonderful
group, by the way.
Right. There was a wonderful discussion a few months back on the listserv regarding bring your own device policies, and Liz wrote up a really good blog post relating to that. Also, I think that incorporating some of those cloud services policies may be the next step for bring your own device policies. And if we revisit this topic and try to come up with a model policy next year, we may definitely do that.
Yeah, I would love to see that when you guys do that. Very powerful group. Okay, thank you guys so much for these really fantastic questions. All right. So, in summary, understand the value of your data. What is it worth to you from a monetary perspective? What is it worth to you from a reputation perspective? What I always like to encourage people to do is to really think through the consequences of a breach that might happen. So, if someone, you just think through the scenario, which is if, this folder got accidentally shared with, the entire public of people who are on Gmail, what would be the consequences of that? What would we have to do as a response to that? How much work would it create for our organization? How much damage would it cause to our reputation? How much damage would it cause to the people whose information was exposed, and what inconvenience would it impose upon them? I find that going through that exercise will kind of help people understand the efforts that they want to take to protect that information. So, going through the first thing of understanding the consequences, of the information being compromised helps you better appreciate what are appropriate actions to take and what are appropriate efforts to expend to protect the data, which is ultimately what this comes down to, right? You don't want to be spending all of your time imposing security and managing security, making life extraordinarily difficult for people to even access information. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you're taking appropriate security measures to protect your information. Your data is no safer than you make it. All right, so this goes back to the very first point that I made, which is any computer attached to the internet is vulnerable unless you protect it. The cloud is not, by itself any more or less secure than your computer, your iPhone, your tablet, or any device that you have that is connected to the internet. It all comes down to what security measures you put in place and what security practices you perform, to keep your data safe. Many vendors can make your data really, really safe. So vendors, Google is one of the only providers that offers two-factor authentication. So you can have your email and your Google Docs protected not only by a username and a password, but by a code that changes every 30 seconds and is sitting on your mobile device. Dropbox is, I don't know if they have implemented two-factor yet. I believe they're going to shortly. But Google's had it for, I think, two or 3 years now, and still don't see it from Microsoft, still don't see it from almost any other cloud vendor. So choose vendors who show they're serious about data protection, and also consider the regulatory compliance. We have reached the end exactly on time. I'm so proud. and we have just a few minutes to take any additional questions that we have. This has really been great. We've had great questions. People have been putting great links up. Really excited to go review all the materials and the policies that you guys have already thought about. So Kate's putting up a link here. Currently liking the Cyberwire for updates on cybersecurity news. So I'll go ahead and just bring that up.
And Microsoft just bought PhoneFactor, so they're gonna roll out a two-factor authentication solution pretty quickly.
Excellent.
Good to know. When did they buy PhoneFactor?
They bought them probably 3 or 4 months ago.
Okay.
I think they bought them specifically for their Azure cloud services, so you could tie two-factor authentication into most of the cloud services that Microsoft's offering.
Gotcha. For those of you who aren't familiar with PhoneFactor, and William, correct me if I'm misstating it, but they basically can kind of add two-factor authentication to any existing login service you have. So you can add the so-called PhoneFactor, meaning they install a code on your phone that will change every 30 seconds that an authentication system like your Windows network will require in order to log in. So for systems like a traditional Windows network that don't support two-factor authentication, you can add it on using PhoneFactor. William, please correct me if I misspoke that, but I believe that's how that works.
Yep, that's it. Yep, that's exactly how it works. There's and it's actually free for smaller organizations. I think there's a 50-user and a 25-user free service that PhoneFactor has that allows you to add two-factor authentication either to a web-based application or to Active Directory LDAP, and they've got a bunch of APIs that they publish to make it easy to integrate with different systems.
Very cool. Have you implemented? Do you mind if I ask, William? Have you implemented PhoneFactor with any service?
We're using it. We do. We use it for any administrative level account. So if you want to use, and there's a plugin for LogMeIn, which is the way we manage most of our machines remotely. So if you jump on LogMeIn and use one of about 4 accounts that have administrative privilege in the domain, then as soon as you you put in your username and password, your cell phone will ring or your desk phone will ring, and then you put in a PIN or hit pound or whatever level of authentication we want PhoneFactor to require.
Very cool. And so you integrated that with LogMeIn's service?
Right. There's a if there's a LogMeIn plugin that we have running on each of the servers in the domain, and so anybody that comes in via LogMeIn is gonna talk to PhoneFactor via that plugin. And we're considering using it. We're looking at AWS and Azure in our hybrid on-premise off-premise architecture that we're looking at implementing. And PhoneFactor will probably end up moving up to the cloud with us.
So two quick things here. There is a link down in the chat to a SurveyMonkey survey for feedback on this. We'd greatly appreciate it if people would take a minute. It's got 5 questions, and it's literally less than 3 minutes to fill out. This is the first time we've done our cloud security, and we have a follow-up one specifically coming up in 3 weeks that is an advanced cloud security. So please watch for that. The other thing is, there was a question over, is this being recorded? Yes, this was recorded. We will have it posted to our YouTube channel, and I'll drop a link to our YouTube channel in the chat here in a second.
All right. Well, I thank everybody so much. This was really terrific. You guys were a just terrific group. The contributions, Brian and William and everybody that put in contributions and questions via the chat, thank you so much. Really makes my job so much easier. And I really appreciate everybody's time today, and I hope that the information was helpful for everyone.
Thank you so much, Josh. We greatly appreciate it. I also want to give a special thank you out to Liz Lehman, our Vista. This is the last webinar that she will be with us. She's been here for a year of service, and we have been so happy to have her. She has been a great asset to this community, and I look forward to seeing where she goes after this, because she'll be a wonderful powerhouse in the nonprofit realm wherever she decides to go.
Very cool. All right, I'm going to drop off. Thank you, everybody, so much.